Well, the problem is there really isn't one. The United States controls the ocean, and if push ever really does come to shove, that's the end of international trade for that country. Uh, the United States plus Europe plus Japan is 80% of all financial heft in the wider world and roughly two-thirds of global consumption. So if you do want to make a go of it, free of these pesky constraints, you have to work with what's left. And what's left is largely dependent upon what you're trying to cut out. So there will always be a question of whether or not the free world is dedicated and willing to put the shoulder into it. And it's now clear that there are certain lines that if you cross, the West is. So it's a calculus. It's economic growth. What pace do you feel that is necessary? Because you're never going to be able to really insulate yourself. It's a question of tolerance. Well, it's going to be massively expensive, but that expense is going to be borne in two ways. So you're going to have places like the United States that are going to have to roughly double the size of their industrial plant in an environment of more expensive capital and more expensive labor. That is going to be hugely inflationary. So my estimate is 9 to 15% for the next 5 years. That assumes we actually build out the industrial plant. If we fail to do that, we're probably going to have similar inflation rates, but at the end of it, we will have product shortages of every type, because we have failed to build out the industrial plant. So for us, there's not a lot of choice. You might as well get the growth that goes with it. And when I say 9 to 15% inflation, keep in mind that this is to build out a supply chain system that is in North America, that serves North America, that uses North America resources and finance, and is simpler and shorter and closer to the end consumer. This is a growth play, not an inflation threat. Inflation is the side effect of what will be the fastest growth in the country's history. This is a good story. But if you are a country that has dominated part of the supply system before, now you have all this stranded industrial plant that doesn't have a consumer, or maybe doesn't even have the raw materials necessary to make it work in the first place. There you get a mix of inflation and deflation, the most destructive combination you can possibly get, as you have shortages or overproduction, sometimes even in the same sector. And that is where you think of a Great Depression as perhaps the best case outcome. The Japanese get a lot of crap for having 0% growth for 30 years now, but they've seen all of this coming, the demographic implosion, the rise of China, the fall of China. And so they took proactive steps over the last 30 years to get ahead of it. Now that cost them economic growth, but they would forward position a lot of their industrial plant in countries with better demographic profiles and more local consumption. And that has allowed them to, I don't want to say skate by and ignore these issues, but they've pre-positioned for it. So they've moved a huge amount of industrial plant into Southeast Asia and especially the United States. And they're now integrating with other younger countries in a way that preserves their economic functionality. Now, this is still the world's oldest demographic structure, and they are not aging all that gracefully. But they've even taken some steps there between encouragement for young people to form families on one side, and the advancement of robotics on the other. They actually now have a higher birth rate than China, Korea, or Taiwan. I don't mean to suggest that their birth rate is high, but I'm just saying that they've taken some steps to mitigate a lot of this, and they are no longer a massively export-driven economy. They've managed to relocate a lot of the stuff to the other side of tariff barriers. It's an issue of scale. Chinese would have to do it to an order of magnitude or order of three, factor of three more. And they would have to also do what the Japanese did, which is roll over and show the Americans your belly. I remember that when Abe, former Japanese Prime Minister Abe, came to the United States, he was forced to accept a insulting trade deal in order to get this sort of integration. But it worked. And then there's the time issue. The Chinese have been working on this since the late 80s. If AMLO really does torch Mexican democracy, it's going to be much more difficult for the United States to maintain a constructive relationship. Or if the Jalisco New Generation cartel does succeed in breaking north of the border. This is a drug cartel that kind of exists in Americans' minds in the right way. Until now, the dominant cartel, the Sinaloa, has been a corporate entity. They think of drug running as a business and violence as a means to an end, not an end. Jalisco New Generation is the opposite. It's a gang that just happens to run drugs. And if they cross into the United States, they will go on a violent spree that will force the Americans to revisit all things Mexico and drugs and trade. And this is now our largest trading partner. This is our single biggest partner in the world to come. And the supply chains that we're reshoring, almost all of them that matter have a big Mexican component. And so if you interlace the drug war into that's a huge problem. It's not guaranteed. AMLO will be gone in a year and a half. Tried to amend the Constitution already and failed. So he personally will no longer be the president. Doesn't mean that he can't undo some of the democratic reforms that we've seen in the last 30 years. So the risk is there, but the risk of him being the big guy is not. And there's nothing to say that Jalisco New Generation might disintegrate, because the drug cartels in Mexico tend to do that from time to time. But that is the biggest risk, in my opinion, to the American way of life and the American economy. Sure. So the issue is, as your population ages, it depends on where the bulge in your structure is. So if your bulge is for people 45 and under, you tend to be a consumption-led society, very high growth, very high inflation. If your bulge is people roughly 40 to 65, you're a technocracy, because you have older people, not a lot of consumption, but a huge amount of capital. That's where a lot of the advanced world has been for the last 20 years. And so that's one of the reasons why capital has been so cheap. It hasn't just been monetary policy. It's been that the baby boomers had been at the capital-rich point of the world. Well, in the fourth quarter of last year, the majority of the world's baby boomers had aged into mass retirement, which meant that they were liquidating all of their savings, because they can't have a very forward-looking portfolio when you're in retirement, because if there's a market crash, you lose everything, and you no longer have the income to recover. So capital costs are going up, and they will continue to go up for the next decade, independent of what happens with the economic cycle or the Fed. That is now baked into the cake. We have passed the Rubicon, and we are never going back to the financial environment that we've seen in the last several years. In fact, we shouldn't expect capital costs to start coming down appreciably until the millennials are in their 50s. That's not until the mid-2030s. So everything that we have to deal with now, starting now, we have to do so with less capital. And that is going to radically slow the rate of economic growth. Now, if you have capital in this environment, and I'm looking at you, Gen X, out there, because all Gen Xers are in their 50s now, and assuming you can keep it away from the tax man, big detail, the rate of return you're going to get is going to be significant, because we just don't have a world awash in free money anymore. But there's not enough capital for what needs to be done. So there's pros and cons based on who you are and what you need. Well, the baby boomers have built into the system a very robust, very generous, very expensive set of benefits for themselves. And because life expectancy in the United States is in excess of 70, they are going to be able to vote to preserve those for a significant amount of time. And the millennials, the second generation, biggest generation we've ever had, does not want the baby boomers to move in with them. From their point of view, living with their parents was a one-way experience. So you've got the two biggest generations in American history voting for a very robust benefits program that all has to be paid for by Gen X. And there's not enough of them. So in any ballot box competition, Gen X will lose. So it'll be a fight for Gen X to benefit from their financial position.